Hello, Gilmore students. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. I want to acknowledge the teachers, staff, and administration at Gilmore and thank them for everything they're doing to keep the students safe. And I would like to thank all the students for wearing your masks, washing your hands, and staying apart from all the kids who are not in your learning cohort. Thank you for doing all these things. It isn't easy, but it's what we need to do to keep ourselves, our parents, and our grandparents healthy. If you were at Gilmore last year on Orange Shirt Day, you may remember when I spoke to you in the gymnasium. I'm thankful to have an opportunity to speak to all of you here today, even if it is virtually, about Orange Shirt Day. My name is Chaslin Galanders. My Niska name is Sisilk. The First Nation that I'm from is called the Niska Nation. It's located in northern BC. If you were to drive to my community, it would take you approximately 20 hours. Two kids who are students at Gilmore. Clara is in grade 4 and Dana is in grade 2. Gilmore School is a very special place for my family. I was a student at Gilmore from kindergarten to grade 7. I have great memories of my time at Gilmore, and I'm happy that my kids are having an opportunity to learn there as well. Some of you may not know what Indigenous means. Indigenous means the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people of Canada. It refers to the people who lived here for thousands of years. Indigenous people across Canada have different languages, practices, and traditions. Some of you may refer to Indigenous people as First Nations, Native, or Aboriginal. All of these are okay, but the preferred word is Indigenous. The word regalia means clothing worn for special occasions. The regalia I'm wearing is what is traditionally worn by Niska people. Today I'm wearing a cedar hat which has been handmade with cedar bark and was a gift from one of my aunts. Thank you to all of you who are wearing orange shirts. Orange Shirt Day is a day that we honor Indigenous children who were sent away to residential schools in Canada, and we learn more about the history of residential schools. This day provides us an opportunity for us to come together in the spirit of reconciliation and hope for future generations of Indigenous children. We stand together to acknowledge the effects of residential school and the legacy it left behind. I'm here to provide you with a brief overview of residential schools. The legacies of residential school has left a tremendous impact on my family. I've prepared a family tree. The orange figures on the chart demonstrate my family members who attended the residential school. You will note my grandparents, great-grandparents, and my aunts and uncles attended residential school. Many of you may think that residential schools existed a long time ago. It is not something that happened a long time ago. Many of the residential school survivors are still alive today. When European settlers arrived in Canada, it impacted the Indigenous people who had been living here for thousands of years. Prior to the arrival of the settlers, Indigenous people had ceremonies, stories, languages, medicines, and arts. The culture of Indigenous people includes the language, the ceremonies, spiritual belief, arts, music, laws, foods, and clothing. Prior to the residential schools, Indigenous children did not attend school, but were taught lessons through everyday life. For many generations, Indigenous people were protected and taught by their grandparents, their aunts, and their uncles and other family members. They were taught by their family members how to drum, sing, and conduct other cultural practices. Indigenous people held potlatches. Potlatches were events in which a leader, referred to as a chief if it was a man, and a matriarch if it was a female. Feasts were held to celebrate marriages, births, and the naming of children. When I introduced myself, I shared with you my Niska name of Sisilk. It's the name I was given at a feast in my Niska community many years ago when I was a child. The first residential school was opened in 1880, and the last residential school was closed in 1986. In 1920, the Indian Act came into force. The Indian Act is a law that allowed the government to treat First Nations people differently than all other Canadians. The Indian Act gave the government the power to regulate the lives of Indigenous people in ways that the other Canadians were not. All Indigenous children from age 7 to 15 years of age were forced to attend residential school. The residential schools were far from the child's home, and the children did not see their parents until summer break, if at all. The parents had to send their children to residential school or they were sent to jail. Some families attempted to hide their children. Some Indigenous families had hoped their children would receive a good education at residential school. Approximately 150,000 Indigenous students were sent to the church-run schools. The residential schools took the children away from their families and their communities. That was the purpose. It was to remove the children from their cultures and their traditions. When the children came to the residential school, they were required to wear a uniform and to cut their hair short. The children were not called by the names given to them by their parents. They were called by anglicized names, or they were issued a number. Some of you may have read the story When I Was 8, and you will remember the name of the character Uliman, and when she went to residential school, they changed her name to Margaret. The residential schools were not provided with enough money to operate. The children were often hungry and cold. The food that they were given did not taste very good, and it was not healthy food. I remember my uncle telling me why he didn't like oatmeal, and it was because he'd eaten every single day throughout the time that he spent at the residential school. So from kindergarten to grade 12, it was every day, he said. The residential schools were overcrowded and not clean. The children did not receive proper medical care when they were sick. For example, when a child had a cavity, they were not provided with a filling. Their tooth was simply removed. And they weren't provided with any anesthetic. Their gums weren't numb. It was just pulled out. Although the children were at the residential school to learn, they didn't receive the education that other Canadians received. Most of their time was not spent learning. They did not learn to read or write, and even though the kids were there for 12 years, they typically left with a grade 5 education. There is no opportunity for the kids who attended the residential school to go to college or university because they'd never actually finished high school. The girls were taught to do laundry, sew, cook, and clean. The boys were taught carpentry, metalwork, and farming skills. The work done by the students was used to run the school. For example, there was no chef or cleaners at the residential school. The cooking and the cleaning was done by the residential school students. The children worked very hard and were not paid for their work. The boys and the girls were kept separate, and siblings were never allowed to interact with each other. They were not allowed to speak to each other. Many survivors have told me their brothers and sisters went to separate residential schools. The children were not allowed to speak their Indigenous language or practice any customs and traditions. It was the government's hope that these Indigenous children would forget their languages, cultures, and traditions. Residential school survivors describe their time at residential school as a time of hunger, fear, a time when they were extremely lonely for their family and their community members. a time when they were horrifically abused. The schools harmed Indigenous students by removing them from their families, forcing them to speak English or French instead of their Indigenous language. They were not allowed to practice their culture and traditions. The orange shirt in Orange Shirt Day refers to the shirt that residential school survivor named Phyllis was given to her by her grandmother for her first day of school at the residential school. When Phyllis arrived at the school, they took away her clothes, including her new orange shirt. It was never returned to her. To Phyllis, the color orange has always reminded her of her experience at residential school. And as she has said, how my feelings didn't matter, how no one cared, and I felt like I was worth nothing. All of us children were crying, and no one cared. Orange Shirt Day was started by Phyllis to educate people about their residential schools and to fight racism and bullying. The experience of residential schools and the existence of Indigenous people was not taught at school when I was a student. It's very important for all of you to know this history. It is something that residential school survivors didn't even tell their children or their families. I want to acknowledge all the children who didn't make it home. We don't know how many Indigenous children died while at residential school and how many died while trying to escape the school. However, we do know that there were at least 3,200 Indigenous people who left the residential school and their family left for residential school and their families never saw them again. I want to thank all the residential school survivors and their families for having the courage to tell their personal and difficult stories. The Government of Canada and many churches who ran the residential schools have apologized and acknowledged that the residential schools were wrong, cruel, and were not effective in educating Indigenous people. The school librarian, Madame Hunter-Mogg, has done a great job of ensuring that you have lots of books within your school library to borrow so that you can keep on learning and building your understanding of Indigenous people in Canada. We look back with sadness and pain when we consider what happened at the residential schools, but we look forward to the future with hope and determination. We must learn from these horrible things that have occurred and ensure that children and families are never treated in such harmful ways again. This is why reconciliation is critical at this time in our country and why all of you are very important in this journey forward.